Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's article publishing process webinar. My name is Daneshri Mutli. I am the customer consultant working with Elsevier. I am joined today by my colleague, Mary Zimmerman, who will be today's presenter. I see a lot of questions in chat already about the muting and unmuting options and how to communicate with each other. So during the session, if you should have any questions that you have for the presenter, you can please use the Q&A box and type your question in. If you have any comments about the presentation or something that you need to communicate with us about, you can use the chat box. A lot of the attendees have asked if this is being recorded. It is. We will also be recording tomorrow's session, and we will be sharing some supporting material with the attendees following today's training session. With that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Mary.
Hi, everybody. Unfortunately, I'm not able to start my video, but hopefully you all can hear me, and I will have some slides anyways, so you won't have to be looking at my face for this. Okay, are you seeing, Dineshri, can you tell me, are you seeing the slideshow version, or are you seeing?
It's a slideshow version for now.
Okay. All right, so again, thank you everybody for hanging with us through technical difficulties. I think for a meeting this size, being able to start 5 minutes past is actually pretty good. So we will jump right in. As Dineshri said, my name is Marianne Zimmerman, and I am a senior publisher of health and medical journals for Elsevier. My background in publishing spans several content types. So if you have questions about books or journals or any electronic products, I've also been lucky enough to cover those. I've worked over a range of subject areas. So I started in nursing. I've worked in health professions. I did some life sciences for a bit. And now my current portfolio, I work on allergy, immunology, and gastroenterology journals. I'm going to cover a range of pretty basic topics today that will hopefully provide guidance on the publishing process, including how to structure an article, how to choose a journal, what happens once you submit to a journal, talk a bit about peer review and preprints as well. If you have any questions while we go through, please enter them in the Q&A. We will have time for questions at the end. And if there's anything I'm unable to get to or that involves more in-depth of an answer, I can put together responses and make sure they're sent out to everyone after the meeting. Additionally, my contact information, I'll share it at the end. And if you want to reach out directly, you can do that as well.
Marianne, sorry, it's still on the first slide.
Okay, so it's not sharing. Hang on, let's do. Are you seeing, sorry, are you seeing on the side of it all of my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not in the mode I thought it was in. All right. Is that better? Are we?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to start with just an overview of publishing and how it works. So the current system of science, technology, and medical publishers, which we often shorten to STM, it's evolved over hundreds of years and serves the science and medical global communities. The industry is highly competitive, so there are some 2,000 publishing organizations ranging from kind of small private ones to really big ones like Elsevier, and there are over 22,000 scholarly journals and 1.2 to 1.4 million articles per year published annually from over 5 million researchers worldwide. So it's quite a huge network. And I should mention these numbers are not updated for 2020 yet. I believe the number of peer-reviewed articles grew tremendously during COVID. So I will be curious to see what the overall output was last year as well. So using Scopus data, SciVal is able to generate snapshots of the research landscape within those 22,000 journals currently being published. So this pie chart shows an overview of research percentage by subject area over the last 5 years. Within those subject areas, you can drill down a little further if you're in SciVal. For example, medicine is pretty broad. It encompasses everything from clinical oncology to radiology. But I think it's just kind of a cool chart to see, and it's fun to click through if you ever have the opportunity to play around in SciVal a bit. There's a lot of interesting information in there. And I compared this to last year's version, so the previous 5 years. The only one that really seemed to be growing at a pace that a 5-year snapshot would capture was social sciences, which I thought was really interesting as well. And there's obviously a lot of interdisciplinary work happening there right now, so that would make sense. The role of publishers and journals has remained pretty consistent despite all of the changes with digital technology, online publishing, and everything that's gone on. These are the 4 main roles that we consider when we think about publishers. So vouching for the timing of publication, this is very important and has possibly become more important with online publishing since there are different versions of the article published at different times, usually at this point publishing online first, but not always. Then there's reviewing the accuracy of research and certifying its legitimacy. This obviously encompasses peer review and journal editors vouching for the quality of research. Making content discoverable and readable for other researchers is obviously a key point. We don't want to put the content out and have nobody read it. So this would, traditionally this was printing and distributing to libraries and individual subscribers. And now it includes digital databases, indexing, making sure people can find the content that they're looking for. And lastly, preserving the scientific record for posterity. So this is just, a very important stamp to make sure that that it's there, it's permanent unless it's withdrawn, and even if it's retracted, there will still be record of it having existed and been retracted, just to make sure that everybody's clear and working from the same information at all times. So next we're going to look at how to plan your article. So before you submit anything, you want to think about, are you ready to publish? And that seems pretty basic, but it's worthwhile to go through a brief mental exercise before putting your article together. You should not consider publishing yet if your work is outdated. So usually we would say you want the work to have been completed within the last 5 years or so. If your work would be duplicating previously published work, or if your conclusions are incorrect or not acceptable. One note on duplicating previously published work, I know there's become an increased interest for a lot of journals on having novel experiments from different parts of the world. So it might be something that has happened already in Europe or somewhere else. But if there's never been an article looking at a specific research area, and I'm thinking in this regard, particularly with medical research in your particular country, it's worthwhile putting that research together. Obviously, you don't want to duplicate anything, but if it's novel to your part of the world, that is really important to capture as well. So those points are good indicators that your report would lack scientific interest or is not substantially advancing the field, which are things an editor will be looking for. You should consider publishing your research if you have information that advances the understanding in a specific research field. So this could take the form of presenting new original results or methods, rationalizing, refining, or reinterpreting published results, or reviewing or summarizing a particular subject or field. Remember that a strong manuscript and message is crucial in order to present your contributions to the scientific community. So once you've established that your research is current, novel, and ready to be published, it's time to think about what type of manuscript you're going to write. These will differ by journal. So always look at the author guidelines, which I will probably say 20 times during this presentation, but the editors spend a lot of time on those guidelines and it will always have the information you need to submit. So again, yes, these will differ by journal, the type of manuscript, but on the screen are the three most common types of manuscripts. So first are full-length articles. These are the most frequent type. This is what you think of when you're thinking of a research article traditionally. It is substantial, complete, and comprehensive pieces of research that are of significance to the field. Usually it's new information. Usually it's based on a research project that the authors have undertaken. And it's generally what's advancing the field forward. Letters or short communications are quick and early communications of significant original advances. These tend to be much more brief than full articles. Again, the guide for authors for any journal will tell you what word count, image count, reference numbers that they would be looking for this. So if your research is still fairly new, or if your work is less established in your field, this can be a great way to get published relatively quickly because there's a lower barrier often. The editor will be looking for less in-depth research and more looking for a novel concept or something that they feel is very important to be reported, but might not have the full weight of research behind it yet. And then lastly is review papers. These summarize recent developments on a specific topic, highlighting important points that have been previously reported and introducing no new information. So these are often submitted after invitation by an editor. Some journals do not even accept unsolicited review papers, but some do. So again, check the author guidelines before you submit. And so, yeah, although I've placed on this slide the three most common types of manuscripts, be aware that there are many more and they all have different names amongst different journals. So, and I see editors discussing new types of articles all the time. So don't be afraid to experiment if that's what your research and data supports. At the end of the day, and this goes for everything presented here, you want to choose what's going to best highlight your work, the work you've done, and get your work in front of the eyes that it needs to be in front of. So what makes a strong manuscript? Strong manuscripts have three key characteristics, and editors will always be checking for these three things to make sure that it fits in their journal and also is of interest to their readers. So first, they want your scientific message to be clear, useful, and exciting. Second, the message needs to be presented and constructed in a logical manner. That enables the reader to arrive at the same conclusion as the author, and the format chosen best showcases that material. If you have questions about how your article should be laid out for a journal, just look at some of the recent articles published in it, and you can get an idea of what the editor's looking for. And then third, they want your article to enable readers, reviewers, and editors to easily grasp the significance of the research. So the more effort you put into a manuscript up front, the more likely it is to be accepted because it's already going to tick those boxes that of what the editor is looking for. And if the editor likes it and the reviewers like it, it will move forward if it is a well-presented manuscript that fits within the aims and scope of the journal. Research articles contain many different sections, and again, check the guide for authors to make sure that if there's any details on what they want to see, that you've hit all of those criteria. But these are the basic sections that you'll find in a full-length research article. So at the beginning are the title, abstract, and keyword sections. These all play important roles in allowing the article to be easily found, indexed, and advertised to potential readers. You want to make these sections informative, attractive, and effective so that the article is easy to index and search. If there are particular keywords that are being used in the field that are of increasing significance, just make sure to include those so you get any related hits once it's published. The main text of the article includes the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. This is where you must present your work and convey the main messages and findings effectively. Note that the reader's time is not unlimited, so you want to make your article as concise as possible. This will also save you time in during the review stages, so you don't have to cut out unnecessary text, but also presenting it as clearly as possible also means trying to keep things concise and tight. And then the last group of section brings up the end of the manuscript, and that includes the conclusion, acknowledgement, references, and supporting materials. However, these are artificial groupings and the order of them can change. Some journals request the discussion section to be combined with the conclusion or results section. Others want it to be its own independent section, so you're just going to want to follow journal style on that. There are also different arrangements of the order. So sometimes people put methods after results and discussion instead of at the beginning. Again, read the guide for authors for specific criteria to the journal that you're targeting. Determining the order of authors on a paper can vary by discipline and by culture, but the general rule is that the first author is the person who conducts or supervises the data collection, analysis, presentation, and interpretation of the results, and also puts together the paper for submission. The corresponding author can be the first author, or sometimes is a senior author from the institution. You should always avoid ghost authorship, which means excluding authors who participated in the work, and gift authorship, which means including authors who did not contribute to the work. Be consistent in how you write the author's names, which you should be able to find on other papers from the journal or in the author guidelines. That is also something if you format the author names incorrectly, that will be fixed generally by copy editors or in review stages. At the beginning of your paper should be title, abstract, and keywords. As I mentioned, these three sections give the reader a first glimpse of what your article is about and is also going to help them find the article when they're searching for something relevant to their research. When crafting a title, you want to be clear and concise and to attract the reader's attention. The editor should have an idea of what your work is about simply from reading the title. If the title catches a reader's attention, the next thing they will check is the abstract. The abstract is freely available in electronic abstracting and indexing services such as PubMed, Scopus, Medline, Embase, things like that, Google Scholar. Because it is the first text they read after the title, it is very important and can help an editor make a preliminary decision on whether to send your paper out for review. The abstract should be a single paragraph, sometimes 2 paragraphs at most, summarizing the problem, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. You want to make it as catchy and accurate as possible to have the greatest impact. Take the time to write the abstract very carefully. Again, it's the first thing the editor sees. It will be the first thing that a reviewer looks at when they're scanning. In many authors, one tip I've heard is sometimes writing the abstract last is really helpful because then it will accurately reflect the content of the paper and you can kind of tie everything together and pull it together after you've written everything else. And then keywords are the labels or tags for your manuscript and are used by indexing and abstracting services. These will help people find your research once it's published. You want to avoid words that have super broad meaning beyond your subject area, just because it won't target readers too much. Including one or two if they're relevant makes sense, but make sure it's in conjunction with more specific keywords. Only use abbreviations that are firmly established in your field of study. So something like DNA would be fine to include. That is, a very commonly used acronym, but something a little more niche than that, you would want to spell out the words. Again, check the guide for authors if there's any details on what kind of keywords they're looking for. The table on this slide contains an actual example of keywords that are associated with an article taken from Science Direct. I think it can just kind of be helpful to see how they're labeling their article. Introduction and methods are the next sections in your paper. The introduction is used to provide context for your manuscript and convince readers why your work advances a field of study. Be concise in the introduction, but give the reader enough information to understand why the work is important. Introduction of letters or short communications can and should be shorter, sometimes only one paragraph. This section shouldn't be a full history lesson or background, but you do need to introduce the main scientific publications on which your work is based. So cite a couple of original and important works that will tell any editor or reviewer that you're basing this on things that are current and that you are aware of what's going on in the field. You can include original research or recent review articles for this. Again, unless it's a big landmark publication from the past, you want to keep those references in this section as recent as possible. So usually within the past 5 to 7 years is a good target. You want to give the reader a sense of how your work fits into the broader literature. Make sure you clearly address what the problem is you're ultimately trying to solve. And then you want to identify solutions and limitations. So are there any solutions? If so, what is the best solution and what are its limitations? What is your work trying to achieve? Provide a perspective that's consistent with the journal where you are submitting. Although it can be tempting to reuse introductions from your previous papers and similar studies, every paper should present a new result and the work should be specifically motivated. This requires a unique introduction every time. Unfortunately, I know that is often very frustrating as an author, but that will also help when the editorial office is reviewing your manuscript for original content. You don't want it to trigger any plagiarism software and be discarded before it's even considered. Then next, the methods section describes how you studied the problem. It's important to be detailed, so a knowledgeable reader should be able to reproduce your experiment based on your methods section. Any previously published procedures do not need to be rewritten in detail. They can be noted in the references or described in the supporting materials section. The equipment and materials used in the experiments should always be identified along with their sources if there's a chance for variability of quality of these items. So if there are different brands of an instrument being used in a research project, you should specify which one you used, which brand, just to make sure it's reproducible and clear to account for any potential differences. If the work is computational or theoretical code, any analytical methods should also be described. Oh, and another note on methods. If your work involves experiments on humans or animals, it must follow the applicable ethics standards, such as the most recent version of the Helsinki Declaration and or any relevant local, national, or international to your field animal experimentation guidelines. Approval of a local ethics committee is required and should always be specified at this point in the manuscript or in the cover letter or the online submission system. Often the online submission system will make you tick a box saying that you received ethics committee approval if it was needed. However, even approval of a local ethics committee does not guarantee that the editors will also agree that the work was done in an acceptable manner. But if you have that approval from the ethics committee, you can make a stronger argument for the editor if they have concerns. Moving on to the very exciting results section. This is where you describe the important results of your research. You should present the results that are essential to the discussion, which means that only data of primary importance should be shared. Data of secondary importance can be put in supporting or a supplementary materials section, or included in another paper, which is often what researchers will do. They'll split a research project into multiple publications. This basically, you don't want to include data that is irrelevant to the point you are trying to prove. But you want to make sure you have that data available in case a reviewer asks for supporting information in that regard. Use subheadings to keep results of the same type together. This will just make the results easier to review and read. And then you want to number the subsections for the convenience of internal cross-referencing. Often there will be details for how to do this within any specific journal, but as long as you're deciding on a logical order of the data and it tells a clear story, that's what the editor is going to be looking for at submission. Then you want to highlight findings that further the understanding in the field, or those that differ from previous findings, and explain any unexpected results. Results can also include illustrations, including figures and tables. They are often the most efficient way to present your results. Your data are the driving force of the paper. Therefore, your figures and illustrations are critical, and they should be for essential data only. The legend of a figure should be brief, and it should contain sufficient explanatory details to explain the figure, often without the need to refer to the text. These figures and tables are really handy also in promoting your work. So having a concise visual to show people, whether it's online, presenting it on a conference slide, anything like that. These can be really helpful promotional tools. Often tables give the actual experimental results. Do not include long, boring tables unless absolutely necessary. And I can say that both as a reader, an editor, and you know, on the production side, the compositors really don't love the long tables, trying to make them as readable as possible. If you really need the long tables, absolutely, you just want to be careful to only include the information that is relevant to the claims that you're trying to support. Otherwise, you can put some of these longer tables in supplementary materials section. Every photograph or image should be presented with a scale marker, and the resolution should be as clear as possible. The discussion section is where you interpret what your results mean. This is often considered the most important section of the article, because this is where you get the chance to really sell your work. A huge number of manuscripts are rejected because the discussion is weak or only includes mere description of the results. So in the results section, you've had the opportunity to present all your data, to explain the results of your experiment or project. And now you get to really spell out in context of the field why it's important and how it is furthering understanding of the field. You want to compare with other published results and do not ignore work that's in disagreement with yours. You want to confront it and convince the reader that you are correct or that you've improved it in some way. Be careful not to use the following. You don't want to use statements that go beyond what your results can support. So it's okay if it's not a big groundbreaking outcome, You want it to be accurate. And even if it, most scientific advances are small incremental changes. So keep it as honest as possible and make sure your results support any statements you're making. You want to be careful also not to use non-specific expressions such as higher temperature or at a lower rate. You want to use very quantitative descriptions based on your data. So make sure the numbers are precise. If you want to use higher temperature, you can use an average or a range, but make sure it's as clear and exact as possible. And then be careful not to introduce new terms in your discussion section. Unless you've already defined or mentioned them in your paper, there's probably no need to bring them into the conversation at this stage. The conclusion is used to show how your work advances the field of study. So your discussion section is elaborating on how your work fits in and talking about anything it agrees or disagrees with and how it's furthering the science. The conclusion should be used to show how your work advances the field. Be clear in the conclusion section to help the reviewers and editors judge your work and its impact. Provide clear justification for how your work advances the field. This can be achieved by indicated uses, extensions, or applications of the work. You don't want to just repeat the abstract here. They serve different purposes, the abstract and conclusion. So although some of the same messages may be mentioned, you want to be careful that they're separate entities from each other. You also don't want to just relist the experimental results here. That's not helping further your argument. One thing that is unique to the conclusion as well is that you can use this space to suggest further experiments that build on your work and point out any relevant experiments that may already be underway. The reference list is where you cite the main scientific publications on which you based your work. Take note that there are now some society journals that also require a conflict of interest statement to be placed before the references section. This is becoming more common. PubMed and Medline are requiring it, and some other funders around the world are starting to require this in papers. So you may be asked to sign off on a conflict of interest statement. Some tips for having a proper reference list are listed here. You don't want to include too many references, especially if they're only tangentially related to your work. You always want to ensure that you have fully absorbed and understood the materials you're referencing. I know especially younger researchers, and I certainly was guilty of this in college at times, reading the abstract and including it as a reference. You want to be careful to avoid that and make sure that you are fully familiar with anything that you're citing. So don't just rely on reading excerpts or isolated sentences or the abstract. Make sure you know what you're referencing. Avoid any excessive self-citations of your own work or from a single region or institute. Check the guide for authors to ensure that you're using the proper format. Presentation in the correct format is the responsibility of the author, not the editor. Most journals won't copy edit for this anymore. They will expect the author to fix the references into the right style. So getting that right up front will save you a headache later. There are also softwares such as EndNote that can help format your references correctly based on what journal you are submitting to. So if you make the editor's work a little easier, they will certainly appreciate the effort on this front. So using proper scientific language. So when you're submitting to a journal, you want to make sure that you've checked the author guidelines for preferred language and style. Without clear and proper language, editors and reviewers will not grasp the full message or impact of your work. Even though the findings you report might be cutting edge, poor language quality sentences tend to confuse readers. Only one idea should be conveyed in each sentence, and multiple statements should be avoided in a single sentence. So to give you an idea of this, the average length of sentences in scientific writing is only about 12 to 17 words. So it's pretty brief, and that's in large part to keep it as clear as possible. If you're worried about the quality of English in your paper when submitting to an English language journal, having a colleague review it or working with a language editing service can help. And most journals can recommend a language editing service if needed. At the bottom here of the slide, you can see there are some suggestions listed here. So Editage is a big one, Journal Edit, Elsevier language editing. There's certainly others available as well. Included this slide because it's often a question that gets asked in most of these workshops. So I think this can be helpful just in terms of turning your thesis into an article if we have anybody on the line who is interested in doing that. So first and foremost, unfortunately, there's going to be considerable rewriting necessary to convert a dissertation and capstone project into manuscripts for peer-reviewed journals. You do have all the information there. You probably have all the sections you need in bits and pieces around your project, but it's not just a matter of cutting and pasting into the journal style. You'll have to mold the content of the dissertation to the journal and not vice versa. There are many differences between a thesis and a journal article, and on the screen you have the primary distinctions. So journals have their own standards, tone, review and approval process, their own format, required elements and language considerations. Editors expect the writing to be succinct and adhere to word limits, which often the thesis is wordier and longer and more thorough. So you'll have to edit and cut down. The best journal articles briefly explain the research, describe and interpret the results, place the work in context of existing literature, and give any implications on current and future research or practice. Journal articles are much shorter than your theses, dissertations, and capstone projects, and authors should adhere to any word limits in the candidate journal. So if you submit your dissertation without any work on turning it into a journal article, it's likely going to be way too long and rejected outright by almost every reputable journal. When preparing to write a journal article, think about your thesis as the extended notes. So some rewriting is always going to be necessary, but again, you've done the hard part. You've done the work, done the research, you have everything you need. Just consider the differences in audience and in format and in tone. And then you're going to want to reformat the introduction, create an abstract and tighten up the method section to be clear for a journal audience versus a thesis. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about selecting the right journal. Obviously, journal fit is one of the hardest things to get right, and also just incredibly important. Selecting the appropriate journal will make sure that your work reaches your intended audience. If your paper is outside the scope of a journal, it will likely be rejected immediately by the editors, not even because of the quality of your work, but because the topic doesn't fit with the journal. So this is a good argument for, don't just submit to the top journal in your field. If it's outside the scope of what the current editor is accepting and looking for, they're likely not even going to review it, and you'll have wasted the time submitting there. It's very important that you do not gamble by submitting your manuscripts to more than one journal at a time. International ethics standards in publishing prohibit multiple or simultaneous submissions, and you would be surprised that the editors do often find out. Sometimes they're published by the same publisher. Sometimes the same reviewer is invited from two different journals, and then it gets back to everyone that way. And then once you're on an editor's mental list as someone who's violating ethical standards, it's going to be much harder to get future work accepted or considered. Remember that your supervisor, who is often a co-author, has co-responsibility for your work. So you can ask them for help if you're in that position of having a supervisor. And also ask your colleagues when you're deciding where to submit. They may be more familiar with different journals or different fields if you're working on something multidisciplinary. Look at the aims and scope for any journal that you're considering. Look at their accepted type of articles, their readership, and current hot topics that the journal is covering. Another tip that can be helpful is articles in your reference section will often lead you directly to the right journals. So if there's something, if you're not sure where to begin, that's often a good way to sift through your references and see if there's anything there that can guide you. There are several of these types of tools. This is Elsevier's. It is the Journal Finder tool. So Elsevier created a Journal Finder tool that can help you narrow down which journals may be a good fit for your research. At the URL listed here, journalfinder.elsevier.com, you can put in your title and abstract of your paper, and it will generate a list of suggested journals. This can be particularly helpful if you are new to publishing or if your work's interdisciplinary. I believe you can also indicate if you are interested in open access or not. I will talk a little bit more about open access in a bit, but basically most Elsevier journals offer the option to publish open access, but don't require it. So if you don't want to pay a fee to publish, you shouldn't have to. So you can indicate that here as well, and that will help you find a journal that fits your needs. Metrics can also help choose a journal. Many people, impact factor is the big one you've probably heard of. Site score is Scopus's metric that is somewhat similar to impact factor, attempting to measure the overall impact of a publication. There are a variety of other metrics that you can dig into, excuse me. And they can help you if you need to compare one journal to another. These can be useful guideposts in quickly assessing a journal's quality, but the top priority, again, should be overall fit and the audience you're trying to reach. So even if it's the top journal in impact factor, make sure that your paper fits the aims and scope. Just a very short slide on predatory journals, although you could do an entire presentation on these. Predatory journals often mimic well-established journals by using a similar name or cover, but they do not follow true scholarly standards, and they often charge authors just to submit their work or go through peer review. And they'll often promise a very quick review process. So if they're telling you, pay us this money and we'll let you know if your article is accepted within one day, that is likely a predatory journal, and you really want to be aware of that. Predatory journals do not follow accepted protocols and should be avoided. It's worth being aware of potential red flags. I can give more information on that at a later time. But this Think, Check, Submit site at the bottom should be able to help you discern if it is a trustworthy journal. A lot of times things you can look for include check the publisher listed on the journal, check the address that they give for the publisher. You would be surprised. Some of them are, they say they have an address and you look it up on Google and it is, a strip mall in the middle of nowhere. That certainly is not a publishing company or a society or anything like that. You can always reach out to either the person listed as the editor-in-chief, or if there's someone listed on the editorial board that you can ask them. Often predatory journals have people listed on their editorial boards who are not actually associated with the journal at all. They've just chosen big names to try to attract authors. And you can ask, your colleagues or others in the field, if this is a journal that nobody has heard of, if there's reason to be a bit weary. So once you've submitted your article and it enters into this beautiful journal publishing cycle, this visual outlines the different steps that publishers in cooperation with editors and editorial boards undergo once a paper comes in. So if an editor sees your paper and believes it could be a good fit for the journal, they will send it out for peer review. Peer review has become the filter that is used to evaluate the quality, comment on validity, judge the significance, and determine originality of research. The process also helps to improve the quality of the paper. In a recent study by the Publishing Research Consortium, over 90% of authors agreed that peer review improved the quality of their paper. Publishers facilitate the review process by investing in developing, maintaining, and upgrading the online There are generally 3 types of peer review when we're talking about peer review, and each journal gets to choose how they want to do peer review. You should be able to find details about which type they use in the author instructions. If you can't find them there, an editor or someone on the editorial team is always happy to answer that question. The first type is single blind review. This is when an author doesn't know the identity of the reviewer, but the reviewer can see the names of the authors. This helps to protect the anonymity of the reviewer, but it could bias the reviewer if they're familiar with the author, whether good or bad. So if this is your best friend and you've been invited to review their work, you could be biased that way. If it's somebody that you've had a bad experience with, it could bias you towards giving it a bad review. So that is one of the risks of single blind review. The benefit of this is that an author's previous work can provide context for the reviewer. So the reviewer kind of has a broader idea of what the author is trying to achieve, and that can often help with providing clearer feedback. In double blind review, everyone's identity is kept anonymous. So the author doesn't know who the reviewer is, and the reviewer doesn't know who the author is. This allows the research, in theory, to be judged without bias, and both the author and the reviewer are protected from criticism that could affect their careers later. Sometimes if it's a smaller field or topic area, the reviewer and author can figure out who each other is, so there's some risk there. And there may be some benefit to having more of that context when reviewing the work, as I said, for single blind review. And then lastly, it's worth also noting open review. This is an interesting one. It's certainly been growing in popularity, but we've seen some journals go to open review and then go back to single or double blind due to a variety of issues, although it does work very well for some journals. So in open review, the identity of the author and reviewer is known by all participants throughout the process. The idea here is that transparency fosters accountability. Although some reviewers may be afraid to be entirely honest in their critiques because they could fear it could be bad for their career. So if they are reviewing the paper of someone very senior in their field, for example, they might be afraid to critique anything too critically. There are also some journals who encounter refusals from reviewers who don't want to participate in open review. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So once an article gets through peer review and recommended changes are made by the author, it enters the journal's production process. So this generally includes copy editing, proofing, formatting, branding, pagination, logo affiliation. Metadata and identifiers are attached to the paper to make them discoverable online. Again, tying back to the keywords you've put together, this is incredibly important. Artwork quality is checked at this point, and the manuscript is converted into XML for web platforms. In Elsevier's case, an XML format for the article is then deposited into our electronic warehouse, we call it. And from there, the article can be published as an online HTML or PDF, or it can be used to publish a print copy and disseminated broadly. So I think nearly 80% of research is still published via traditional subscription models. I know that there's often misinformation that authors have to pay to be published, and that is very untrue still. Although open access is quickly growing, most researchers are still publishing for free in subscription journals. Open access, so if anybody's unfamiliar, open access journals require the author, funding body, or institution to pay an article publication fee. And then once the article is published, it's made freely available to anyone with a different copyright license, usually meaning that it can be reused by individuals without needing permission. Some journals exclusively publish open access articles. I think I said this earlier, but most Elsevier journals allow authors to publish open access, but don't require it. In other cases, subscription journals, they offer the opportunity. Open access is also growing because some funders are beginning to mandate that any research they support be published open access for everybody to read. So this is just to wrap up the whole section of submitting to a journal, some tips to keep in mind. So first of all, always take your time to select the best journal for your research. This doesn't necessarily mean it's the top journal in the field, but that your work fits within the aims and scope and will appeal to the journal's audience. Next, I have referenced it several times in this presentation, and I cannot overstate it enough. Always, always, always read the author guidelines for the journal you want to submit to. If you think you have something to share, but either don't have enough research completed or not enough novel information to add to the literature, consider submitting a brief report or short communication, depending on the journal and what they offer. These are often easier to get published, and they still provide a platform for your work. If you think your paper will require language editing, it's worth addressing this before you submit it. You want the language to be as clear as possible so an editor can understand the main argument of your paper. If they don't understand the main argument of your paper outright, they will not take the time to send it for review and will likely reject it right away. By taking the time before submission to address language concerns, you will increase your chances of review and acceptance. If you have any questions about whether your paper fits or concerns about whether something is related to your paper, reach out to the editor-in-chief or perhaps an associate editor, especially if there's someone located at an institution near you or even your institution. Regional editors should be able to offer some guidance in submission and publication and are often happy to do so. I will make a note, if you do reach out to the editors, make sure you are addressing the correct editor. I've had various editors disregard queries from potential authors for sending them a message with the name of a different journal or a different editor's name from another journal, as you just want to be very careful that when you're writing to them, you are writing to the right person. But always, if you have questions, reach out to one of the editors on the journal. They're usually very happy to discuss or respond. And then always make sure if your work requires ethics committee approval or necessary conflict of interest disclosures, that you have that ready to go. That needs to be included as part of the manuscript. And then lastly, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about preprints. It was mentioned earlier in the presentation that this kind of comes before submission to a journal. Certainly not required, but they serve as a way for researchers to share their work before it's been published or even peer reviewed. There are a variety of preprint servers. Elsevier owns SSRN. bioRxiv is a big one. medRxiv is a big one. There are institutional repositories. There are any number of places to post your paper before it's been peer reviewed. Once they're posted to a preprint server, they do receive a digital object identifier more commonly known as a DOI, which are also assigned to any published paper in a journal. A DOI can be viewed and cited, and the idea is that it's a benefit to authors for their work to be seen more quickly, for them to get credit for their work in the case that other teams might be working on similar research, and to get feedback before submitting it to a journal. There are a couple of things to be careful about when it comes to preprint servers. So first, you want to be cautious about citing preprints in your research. Because preprints are not yet peer-reviewed, they should not be cited as established information. Journals are starting to include this in their author guidelines, whether or not they allow citations to preprints. So worth being aware of that and making sure that you're following the guidelines of the journal that you are submitting to. It's also worth noting that journals have different policies on whether they'll accept submissions that have previously been posted to a preprint server. So many support authors and allow this, and some do not allow it for a number of reasons, often having to do with wanting one version of record for citation. Again, check the author guidelines for the journal before submitting or posting anything on a preprint server. Preprints became even more popular over the past year due to COVID, with researchers posting early research. The benefit of accelerating science and creating an online conversation with others definitely helped to push things forward in some ways, but there were also some very high-profile cases where items posted to preprints caused incorrect information to spread. So some have become more critical of them over the past year, especially in the medical research space. And this is from the middle of last year, but you can already see the COVID growth, especially in health, of more of these papers being published. So it's very interesting, in my opinion, to look at the number of preprints posted per discipline. You can see that social and physical sciences far exceed the other research areas. Preprints became more popular there much earlier, although there's large growth happening in health in 2020. I think that growth certainly continued throughout 2020. 2021 is leveling off slightly so far, but I would imagine that we'll continue to see strong numbers in that area. There are currently about 50,000 preprints being posted every month, and that number is continuing to grow. So a very high number of papers. Elsevier's specific preprint policy. So for most Elsevier-owned journals, authors are allowed to share their preprint anywhere at any time. We encourage authors to link from the preprint to their formal publication if it is accepted for publication in a journal in order to keep version integrity intact. And just some final considerations for preprints. Preprints receive their own DOIs, as I said. So in theory, people can continue to cite the preprint instead of the final article. This can cause confusion if significant changes were made during peer review. So you always want to link to the final published article if it differs significantly from, especially if it differs significantly from the preprint. As mentioned previously, there's a risk of incorrect, unvetted information spreading with preprints. This happened with COVID, with many journalists picking up information in preprints and reporting it, and the public freaking out, and then it not holding up in peer review. So you need to be very careful about that and mindful of what you're submitting. On the other hand, it can really help to accelerate research, especially during a time like the pandemic, where speed is so crucial in saving lives and treating patients. Lastly, there's not much in place to keep a lay audience from interpreting research incorrectly, which can also aid the spread of misinformation. So that is all of my slides. I will dip into the Q&A. I see there are several open and some have been answered, and then I can check the chat a bit too. Okay, so I completed my master's and I want to publish my research. Can I do that, or do I need to complete PhD to publish? If I can publish, do I need to do so with my supervisor, or can I do it myself? These are great questions, and I think something a lot of people ask. So you do not need a PhD to publish your research, as long as the information is scientifically sound and holds up to a journal's requirements and standards. You can absolutely submit your research. You don't. The supervisor question's a little harder without knowing your research area or what you're publishing. Supervisors often like to be included if they helped with the experiment. If they didn't do much, you could talk to them. I would always be open with your supervisor, so you don't want to burn those bridges early on, and you want to make sure that they understand if you are if you're not going to include them, what your reasoning is, so you can keep them on good terms too. So that's a little more individual. I would have to understand the circumstances better, but hopefully that helps. Where can we download the guide for the writing style and number of words? So every journal, you can, honestly, what I do when I'm trying to reference, look up a journal's article types, word counts, things like that, I will just Google the journal and guide for authors, and it will take you, journals usually have a website with that information listed. That will give you word counts, reference counts, anything you need is in there. It's often a long and very boring document, but that will help you better develop your manuscript and make sure everything is straightforward. Okay, who deserves to be a co-author? That is a whole other conversation. Certainly, the co-authors should all be people who contributed either to the writing of the article or to the experiment itself. I would, there are some journals that have started instituting authorship roles. So along with listing the authors, you also have to note what they contributed to the paper. So that could be data analysis, that could be modeling, that could be actual physical research, that could be writing, editing, language editing. So there's a number of things that can be considered roles in authorship. Again, if you have questions about whether a journal would would qualify someone as an author, you can reach out to their editorial office and ask. But usually you don't want to include anybody who hasn't been closely involved in the process in some way. Are there any key differences between publishing in scientific and medical journals and publishing in the social sciences and humanities? This is a very good question, and one that I'm not sure I can adequately answer. Scientific and medical journals, they have probably a stricter version of what an article looks like. So again, going through the article format that I described earlier with title, abstract keywords, methods, discussion, results discussion, conclusion. You're going to see within scientific and medical journals a much more standard version of what that looks like. Social sciences and humanities, you have different types of articles often. They don't necessarily all follow that same scientific process. And again, if you are straddling those different subject areas or you're interdisciplinary in any ways, having a look at the journals in those differing fields can give you an idea of how they might be different. But certainly if you are interested in publishing in humanities or social sciences journals, I can point you in the direction of some resources that can help more specifically with that, because this is certainly focused more on science, technical, and medical. But that is a very good question. In the 3 types of manuscripts, do you mind providing us with at least a generic structure for each one? So for that, I'm going to say the same thing I've been saying throughout this presentation. Please look at the guide for authors for any big journal in your field. They will give you an idea of what those articles, what they want them to look like. If you look at recently published articles, it will show you exactly how they differ from one another and what those sections are. So I gave you the structure I went through in detail here was for full-length articles. For brief communications or short communications or whatever the journal is going to call their shorter version of an article, it's somewhat similar, but very much condensed. So you'll still have a short introduction. You will still have a short method section. You will still have a short discussion of the results. And often for this, the discussion section will be a bit broader. So it will just be saying, you know, these are preliminary results. Here's why we think it's interesting. Here's all the follow-up we want to do. But it will follow that same scientific structure of a full-length article. For review articles, they are kind of a different beast because they are reviewing recent literature in a field. And again, that is usually invited by the editor. So I wouldn't put together a review article without either being invited or knowing that a journal will consider it because most will not consider unsolicited review articles. And for those, you can look at recent examples should you be invited to write one. Is recommendations necessary in a research article? So I'm assuming this is talking about the discussion and looking at where this fits in the literature and recommending future possible experiments. So certainly articles get published all the time without these recommendations in them. I think it can help show an editor and a reviewer that you've thought about your work in the context of not just what's already been published, but what needs to be or can be investigated in the future. And it helps them put that in context as well. So as explicit as you can be there, I think is valuable and will help your article be accepted, but it's certainly not required. What should be contained in the supporting materials for an article? That is a good question. I did not cover that in detail here, so very good question to bring up. This is going to differ by journal. Again, most author guidelines will tell you what to include in the supporting or supplementary materials. It can include additional data that's not strictly necessary for the paper to be in the paper itself, but that is supporting and that you want to include and submit. It can include, you know, if there are additional charts or tables that you've created, but again, aren't 100% necessary within the body of the paper, but you would like them to be available to the reviewers or to authors or to readers, just to help broaden the scope, the context of your work. You can put that there. You know, sometimes if there's additional text or more information about the method section, although the method section should be as clear as possible in the body of the paper, sometimes I've seen it elaborated on in the supporting materials as well. Basically, a lot of things that you or one of the authors would like to include in the body that don't need to be there. The supporting materials online give you an opportunity to still include that without it being in the body of the paper. Why do some Elsevier journals take a long review process? The challenge with this is that some methods may become obsolete when the manuscript is still under review, or some of the novel work originally innovated by researchers may be published in other journals and claim novelty. I am nodding as I read this question. So yes, some journals do take a lot longer to review. This standard time is going to differ by subject area in a lot of ways. So I would say social sciences and humanities, you will see much longer review times. And then also for top journals, you often see quicker review times because people are more eager to review. If your work is particularly in a very specific subject area where it might be difficult for a journal to find reviewers, that can add time to the review time as well. I would say for most journals, they are aiming to have, and this is a very, I'm painting with very broad strokes here, but most journals aim to have 2 to 3 reviewers invited within a week of receiving your paper. And then they usually give 2 to 3 weeks for the reviewers to get their comments back. That 2 to 3 weeks is very ambitious, and often they end up waiting longer than that. If a reviewer then drops out and says, I can't do it, sorry, they have to invite another reviewer, and then that starts the clock over again. Once they receive the reviewer's comments, the editor usually goes through them, and then you should receive it back. So that review process, I would say, shouldn't be taking more than 2 to 3 months. And then, of course, you then respond to it. It often goes back to the reviewers again. So that certainly adds more time to that 2 to 3 months. But most of the time, if it's taking significantly longer than that, that is probably a sign either that they're having a hard time finding reviewers for your specific paper or topic area. And that's absolutely no slight to your research. It just means they might have a limited pool, or they might not be able to find someone who has the time right now. But if the timeline, if it drags on for a long time, that's often the reason. If it's been longer than 3 months, I would say reach out to the editorial office and just ask for an update, and they should be able to give you some idea of how much longer it will be. Do colleagues who edit the article for style, tone, and or fact checking count as authors, or should just be acknowledged at the end? This is a personal choice. So I would say it depends on how involved they are. If they have really changed the readability of your article, and if they are also, able to, if they're also contributing to the scientific message. So if they're making the message clearer, if they are editing for content as well as for structure, I would include them as an author. If they're kind of just copy editing, I think just an acknowledgement at the end would be absolutely fine. Do you always charge to review manuscripts? No. So there are some journals that have submission fees. That is rare, but they do exist. And then there are some journals that if you want to publish open access and have it freely available to everyone without a subscription, you will have to pay an article publishing charge. Beyond that, most papers are still published for free to the authors and publish subscriptions. So anybody who wants to read it will need a subscription to the journal, but you shouldn't be charged for that. And that can often be a sign. It's tough because open access journals will charge an author, but so will predatory journals. If you ever have questions about that, I'm happy to take a look at a journal and give you my opinion on whether it's a legitimate journal or potentially predatory, because that can be hard to figure out sometimes. Can the author use keywords that are not used in the title but have been used in the article? Yes, absolutely. The author can use keywords that are relevant to their research. It does not at all have to be in the title. So any word in the title is going to function as a keyword in searching already. So adding additional keywords that aren't in the title is actually a great practice to make sure, to make your article more discoverable when people are searching. What do you do if your article has been rejected? If you decide to strengthen the article, can one submit it as a new, or the journal should be informed that the article was once submitted? So there is a decision for many journals called reject and resubmit. In that case, I think you can certainly resubmit to the same journal. If you are going to heavily revise and resubmit to the same journal, I think you need to be clear about that to the editor and just say, I've addressed X, Y, and Z issues. I've made these changes based on reviewer feedback. Please consider this as a new submission. And then you can then resubmit to the same journal, and they should hopefully consider it as a new submission. But you would need to have substantial changes there often if they've outright rejected your article. Do you publish work that does not have ethics approval? Most journals will not publish work that does not have approval from the ethics board at your institution. Again, the author guidelines will tell you what sort of ethical approval they're looking for, what sort of documentation they might need. But this also often follows, the criteria for this often follows whatever the main guidelines are for the country that the journal is based in. So you'll see that differ slightly from journal to journal. Again, you're always going to want to check the author guidelines, but broadly speaking, most journals will not publish work that does not have ethical approval if it's a research program that would require it. Is there any possibility to have figures and illustrations for a conceptual article based on literature genre? I am slightly confused by this question. If you want to follow up with me separately with more details, I can dig into that a bit more because I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. When writing up your results section, would you include published literature as well? Or is reference to literature made in the discussion section only and not the results section at all? So this is a very good question. So when writing up your results section, you want to focus primarily on the results of your own work. You don't necessarily need to include other published research in this section. Like you said here, your understanding is absolutely correct that reference to literature made in the discussion section, that's really where you want to provide that context. If there's something very relevant to your results from a previously published article that you really need to cite in order to elaborate on your own results, you can use that, you can put that in results, but generally speaking, you would not be including other published literature in your results section. You would be focusing just on your work that you're submitting here. Do not use too many references, please quantify. That is a very difficult one. So some journals, and certainly for certain types of articles, they will have a limit on number of references, and that information will be in their author guidelines. It's going to depend on the editor. It's going to depend on what article you're publishing, what you're writing about. Some are going to require a high number of references. But the main idea is don't cite things just to cite them. Make sure they are relevant to the argument you're making, to the discussion you're trying to promote. Including 300 references is often unnecessary for most papers. So you just want to keep things concise and tight and only cite things that are really contributing to the discussion in your paper. I know that's not not an exact answer, and you asked me to please quantify, but that's unfortunately not possible without more details or without looking specifically at an article. What sets the conclusion apart from the introduction? So the conclusion is going to tie everything together. And one of the things the conclusion will do is end the paper with here's what I told you, here's what I did, and then here's kind of other ideas of future, how this can guide the field in the future, why it's important, and ideas for other experiments, or elaborating on this in the future. The introduction would not get into any of those last details I just mentioned. So the introduction is largely just, here's what we set out to look at. Here's what, a brief idea of how we did it. And then here's what we believe that we've shown in our research. So they are going to mirror each other somewhat, and they should, but the conclusion should leave the paper with a here's what comes next as well, which the introduction will not have. Do type of results matter in deciding whether material is publishable or not? By results, I mean either a negative result or positive result. Do negative results get the same consideration as positive ones, seeing that they do not move the science forward? This is such a good question, in particular because this is a huge focus in the scientific community over the past 5 or 10 years or so, because I think what you're indicating here is very correct in that, especially top impact, top of their field journals will shy away from publishing negative results because they don't get cited as often, and they don't contribute to the journal's impact factor in the same way. However, the scientific community believes that negative results are just as important as positive results, and we really need to be reflecting that those negative results are occurring in order to either support or negate the ideas that are being put forward by the positive results. There are a lot of journals have increased their focus on publishing negative results, or at least on monitoring negative results in some sort of review paper, things like that. So I do think it's worth submitting negative results, but you just need to be aware that a lot of those super high impact journals are not going to publish negative results, unfortunately. But that is a very good question. Reproducibility is one of the challenges of experimental-based research. How do you handle that in a discussion when results are deviating from the previous findings? I think this goes back to the point that you always include information in your discussion, references to papers that both support and disagree with your conclusions. I think if your results are deviating from previous findings, that's incredibly important to report. And I think giving that full context, both to the editor and potentially the author, if it gets published, is vital. I mean, chances are if you don't include it, if you aren't upfront about the fact that, I wasn't able to reproduce these results, a reviewer is likely to figure that out, whether because you're avoiding it or avoiding other research that contradicts what you're coming up with, or it's just not a fully complete argument. So reproducibility is a huge challenge. If you find, there's also an argument that if you find something, if you try to reproduce something that you've seen published somewhere and you're unable to do it, and you feel that we followed the method section, everything should be correct, and you're unable to reproduce it, contacting the authors or the editors of that journal is not always out of the question, especially if you feel that there's some major flaw that needs to be addressed with a core agendum or errata, or possibly a retraction if it's extreme enough. But reproducibility is a huge, huge challenge. So I hope that answer helped. I think just be as clear as you can about it. Make sure that you include supporting and contradicting information in your discussion, and be upfront about where the results deviated from previous findings. And, if you have ideas of why, explaining that as well. When does self-citation or referencing become excessive? Another excellent question. So this one, cite your own work as much as you need to within the article, as if you would cite someone else's work. So if your work is almost always going to be building on your previous work. So it's absolutely okay to cite yourself. If it does start getting excessive and you're only citing yourself, I think an editor or reviewer is going to call you on that, and rightfully so, because you should be, certainly you're not the only one in the field who's furthering research. And you also, if you are citing yourself pretty heavily because you're at the front of your field and actually you are on a lot of these papers, just make sure there are other supporting peer references as well. It's hard to give a percentage or a number. I wouldn't go probably above 20% of your references being self-citations for a paper. Is there a limit on the number of words, pages, figures, and tables one can use? Always check the author guidelines for the journal you're submitting to, is the answer to that. There likely will be a limit on words, pages, figures, and tables, and the journal can tell you what that will be. At the end, can you share the guidelines of presentation? Yes, I think the presentation will be shared with everybody after. You include sentence writing and one idea per sentence. What about the info about paragraphs within a subtopic? So the idea of that statement about writing a sentence with only one idea per sentence is just to keep things as clear as possible. Within a paragraph, focusing on a subtopic, you can certainly cover multiple subjects in that, or if you're saying that the paragraph is focusing on one topic, I think the idea there is just to keep things concise and clear. So no matter where that sentence is appearing, or whether it's in a subtopic or, wherever it appears, the concept I was trying to get across there is just keep the sentence concise and short. Don't overcomplicate it. If there's a separate thought you want to include, put it in the next sentence. It's just going to make it more readable and easier to understand for, someone outside of our own head. Sometimes we think it makes perfect sense, but you need to make it readable to probably multiple editors, multiple reviewers, and then ultimately the author. Difference between theses and dissertation, they are basically the same thing. So I was using them interchangeably there, but it's going to just depend on country, on institution, what kind of final research project they're looking for. But theses and dissertation are generally a very similar project to one another. Referring to quoting diverse spectrum of authors. This is not a free choice, as seminal authors are preferred. Hence, if you do not cite them, you may not favor publication, or you will be told to include seminal authors without naming them. I find this a stumbling block for new upcoming authors, as we cannot promote them freely. I think that's a very, very strong point. So I do know I've been on conversations with editors where they talk about, well, this is a really good paper, but they missed this, this seminal publication that really should be cited here. In which case, I think they'll usually, a good editor should go back to the authors and tell them that, especially if it's a younger or newer author who might not be as familiar with that background. I'm not sure if you mean it's a stumbling block for new up-and-coming authors because they're not being cited or because they don't know to cite them. I don't think this prohibits younger up-and-coming authors from being cited. If their work's published somewhere and it's relevant, it should still be cited. And if an editor is telling you it shouldn't, that is a big ethical issue as well. If the point is that, you know, those up and coming authors might not know they should be citing these seminal publications, then a reviewer or researcher really, or a reviewer or editor really should give more guidance. If they just say include seminal authors without naming them, it's not, you absolutely are within your rights to go back and say, I'm sorry, can you tell me in more detail what you have in mind here? I did a literature review when publishing this, and I think I've covered all of the recent research that I feel is relevant. So if you can tell me what you feel I'm missing that would add here, I would really appreciate it. And just, you know, be clear and upfront with them. I think that would help in that regard. But that is a very good point, that you don't always have a free choice, because seminal authors are certainly, you know, editors are looking for those names as references. Can articles be written only from research work done, or can it be from other conducted analysis of a particular work, such as incubation policies documents? Good question. It does not have to be conducted research. That analysis is also, for a lot of journals, very important. There are journals very specific to policy in different fields, so there's definitely outlets for that as well. The journals that I'm talking about very broadly, when I say research articles, they're often based on research work, but it certainly does not, it's not solely that. So that's a good question. You can absolutely submit articles on conducted analysis. When entering information, title and abstract on journalfinder, where is that information stored exactly? I don't believe it's stored anywhere. I think it's just, it almost works like a specific search engine. So it's taking the keywords from your title and abstract and comparing them to the aims and scopes of various journals, and then kind of spitting out a bunch of suggestions. It's certainly not perfect, but it can give you a working list to then investigate more closely. So that information, as far as I know, is not being stored anywhere. It's just being used to help you find a journal. Should predatory journal papers be referenced in one's work? No. I think validating, it's very unfortunate because very good authors end up publishing work in predatory journals, and then those predatory journals disappear, but because the work's been technically published, they can't publish it elsewhere. So they end up suffering because they're unable to disseminate and use that research. But predatory journals should not be referenced because the work in them is generally not peer reviewed. It's not scientifically vouched for in the same way. And the scientific record likely will not remember it. And then, don't you think there should be a universal position on this within the academia and research communities? What's your take on this? Yep, so that's my take on it. And that's generally accepted too. I know I had a situation last year with a medical journal where there were a few citations in the reference list to journals that they had never heard of, and we looked into it and they were predatory journals, and the editor asked that those references be removed. Fortunately, there were enough other references in those sections that it didn't take away from the content of the paper at all. They just were asked to remove them. So I agree. I think that should be standard across the board, but it's something that is not as openly discussed or stated in any guidelines anywhere. So there's certainly work that they could do better work on that to make that clear for authors and for anybody who, you know, I think highlighting predatory journals in that way would also be beneficial for the broader community, making sure that making people more aware that that's an issue. What actions can be taken when the editor or the journal does not provide feedback over a prolonged period of a year? What are the chances of paper article being rejected, but information stolen and revised for publication by the reviewers? Actions that can be taken when the editor or the journal does not provide feedback over a prolonged period. I'm assuming by now you've probably reached out to the editor or to the editorial team That would always be my first step. If you haven't heard anything and you aren't sure whether your paper is out for review at all, I would give them a few opportunities to get back to you. And if they don't, I would probably withdraw the paper and submit it elsewhere. I just don't, I think that's poor communication and poor management. They should at least be telling you where things stand. And if they're not doing that, I would withdraw the paper and submit it elsewhere where you're going to have probably a better experience. What are the chances of the paper or article being rejected, but information stolen? It does happen that reviewers, take information from something they've reviewed and publish it themselves. It is incredibly rare. And when it does happen, it is such an ethical misstep that it usually gets blown up into a big thing and potentially ruins that person's career who stole the information. So I wouldn't worry about this too much, although I can entirely understand the concern, especially when you've been waiting for review for over a year. So again, that's another reason to withdraw and resubmit it elsewhere. Roughly how long does the review process take? Can it take up to 6 to 12 months? It's going to vary based on journal. I think best practice would be for that first review to be done within 3 months, 3 to 4 months. But that's not necessarily always the case. It can vary depending on your subject area, how difficult it might be finding reviewers, how familiar reviewers are with the journal, what the journal's timeline is. Most of my journals give reviewers 2 to 3 weeks. But other journals I know give up to a month, sometimes 6 weeks, depending on how long they want to give reviewers to turn things around. So 6 months, I absolutely can see 6 months. 12 months, I think is getting long. I think anything above, I think after 6 months, I would touch base with the editorial office. And if they're communicating with you and explaining where things stand, that's one thing. If they are not communicating at a year, I would certainly withdraw your paper and submit it elsewhere. Okay, this is an interesting one, and I've seen this happen. So I had a nasty experience with the editor-in-chief of a reputable journal on preprints. He considered my preprint in an online journal as plagiarism when submitted thereafter to his journal outlet. Kindly guide me on this. Yeah, this is still such a sticky position. So there are some journals that do not accept submissions of articles that have been posted on preprint servers. And that is their editorial stance, and they are allowed to do that because as they consider it previously published, because it's posted online, it's searchable, it's available, it has a DOI. More and more journals are allowing authors to submit papers that are on preprint servers, but it's still kind of split. So, I mean, the guidance here is just before you submit to a journal, check their guide for authors and see what their policy is on preprint papers. Increasingly, journals are allowing it. Like I said, almost all Elsevier owned journals allow articles published on preprint servers to be submitted, and it wouldn't be considered plagiarism. So this is still kind of in a shifting space where I think we're getting closer to the point where all journals will allow preprint submissions, but some still do not. So I'm sorry that you had a nasty experience. The editors should not have been nasty with you about it. They should have just said it's not their policy to accept them. So yeah, always check the guide for authors. That information will be there. If it's not there before you submit it, just send an email to the editor or editorial team and say, do you accept submissions that have been posted on a preprint server? So this one I'm going to attempt to answer because it speaks to something I said a few minutes ago. What is the best way to withdraw an article submitted to a journal, especially if the article is still in review for more than a year? Generally, if you log into the submission system, there will be an option to withdraw the article. There will be a button in there. I am unfortunately not able to speak to where that button is. But I know for editorial manager, which is what a large number of journals use, there is a withdraw function. So I would say go log back into the editorial system where you submitted the article, and you should have the option to withdraw it. Do brief reports or short communication require ethical clearance? It's going to depend on the research that you've done. It's more that sort of thing. So if the research project that you've conducted is the sort of thing that would require ethical clearance, then you're going to need to be able to note that in your brief report or short communication. They're still going to want to see, you know, this was approved by reviewed and approved by the ethics committee on whatever date before they're going to publish it. So yeah, it's going to depend on the content more than the type of article. Sorry, I'm scrolling through. Preprint publications are not peer reviewed, so how can that be used for research and evaluation by institutions? In theory, it should not. I think generally on people's CV, it should be noted if a paper is on a preprint publication versus published in a journal. And that, you know, it can show that you've written these, that you've posted them and you're sharing them, but that it's not finally published. So it can be used by evaluation by an institution in that you're putting together articles and you're sharing with the scientific community. It should not be used as proof of publication. They shouldn't be considering it, you know, finally a peer reviewed and published article. They should kind of be balancing them differently. I know that a lot of institutions and the people doing the reviews don't always necessarily know the difference between the two. And so that is unfortunate, but you know, I know we are doing our best to educate universities and institutions about that. And, you know, would suggest the same if you're in that position of having things reviewed, just being clear about where something is posted and whether or not it's finally published. Is it possible to transform your PhD thesis into a book? Yes, absolutely. People do that very frequently. You likely will still have to edit it, change formatting and things like that. But if you think that it is more relevant as a book than a journal article, you can reach out to an acquisitions editor or content person in your field at the publisher. I can point you in the right direction if you need help with that, who can, you know, take a look and let you know if it's something they would be potentially interested in. How long after completing my master's can I publish my work? I completed 4 years ago and I would still like to publish. I think a good rule of thumb is 5 years. You want, especially because you want most of your citations or references to be within the past 5 to 7 years. So if you would like to publish your work, you're likely going to have to update some of your references, just see what's been published since you wrote it 4 years ago, because they're going to want to make sure that your research is as up to date as possible when they publish. But 4 years is certainly not a deal breaker. I would start doing that work and submit as soon as possible. Can you please comment on data repositories? So data repositories are places online where you can, generally for free, post your own data. Again, this is along the lines of open access. So it's part of the open science movement to make that information available so that others can access it. It's supposed to help with transparency and reproducibility. Some journals require that you post your data in a repository. Most don't require it, some recommend it. And then basically your paper will link to wherever it's posted, that data repository, so that people can review it. And it's just another place to post it instead of, the supporting materials with your article. There are hundreds of these data repositories. Figshare is a big one. Elsevier is called Mendeley. We recommend authors posting content there, but it's again, just to give people access to your data sets in case they would like to build on them, use them, try to reproduce your results. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through some questions. Some of these are similar to ones I've already answered. Does it make any difference where an author appears in a list of authors, i.e. if an author's name appears in the middle, does it mean they are not as significant as the one who appears first or last? So that's a good question. So the first author listed is usually the person who conducted the experiment and coordinated everything. The last person is usually considered the corresponding author. It's often the most senior person. And those two are usually considered the two quote unquote most important, but more so most involved people with the paper in one way or another. Having your name listed in the middle does not generally change. It doesn't change authorship. You're still getting the same credit online of being an author. And again, it's another reason to stress the importance of only including authors who have contributed. That way, we're not looking at these long author lists, assuming that people have just added their entire department to help everybody out. So there's certainly journals are trying to be more focused on only including authors who have significantly contributed. So I think that the idea that you haven't done as much because you're stuck in the middle should hopefully not be the case. And certainly we're trying to get further away from that. So hopefully that helps. Sorry, I realize we have 10 minutes, so I'm trying to scroll and get some questions that are a little bit different. Is it allowed to submit one article in different journals for publication? Not at the same time. Please only submit to one journal at a time. When it is rejected or withdrawn from that journal, you can submit it to another journal, absolutely. But not simultaneously. Make sure you are only submitting to one journal at a time. Does Elsevier offer funding for conducting undergraduate research? Elsevier does offer a range of funding through different programs. I can share a link. Let me make a note to myself to share a link for that. It depends, where you're based, what kind of research you're doing. But I can share a number of links. You have to apply for them, but if you get it, there is funding available. Okay. Sorry, just making a note on that. Some research do not have latest references because the areas haven't been done recently. What do you do in these cases? You use whatever is the most current you can find. If there's no current research in that area, it's absolutely okay to say that and just to use what is most current. And, you know, if you're submitting to a journal in that subject area, the editor and reviewers should also be aware if there's nothing more recent. So you should be okay on that front. What is the relationship between peer review team and journal team? Are they one team or different teams? That's a good question. I did not cover that clearly. So the journal team is usually the editor. Sometimes they have a managing editor or associate editors, and they're the ones who are making decisions on manuscripts. Peer review team is not at all, in most cases, does not work for the journal. They aren't technically even related to the journal. When they're inviting peer reviewers, they are searching for someone else who has expertise in the area that your article is on. Sometimes they ask for suggestions for peer reviewers, and so you can list them, but often they're just searching keywords, finding someone unrelated to the journal who does research in the same area and asking them if they'd be willing to review the paper. So they're not one team. There are some journals, if they get a high number of papers, they will have a quote unquote reviewer panel. So some of those reviewers will be related to the journal in that way, and those people just do a higher number of reviews, but they will still also use reviewers outside of that system. If conflict of interest arises, what do journals usually do? There are a number of processes you can look up on Committee of Publishing Ethics, Publication Ethics, COPE online. I think it's just COPE, or no, it's publicationethics.org. There's a number of different agreed upon methods to address different conflicts of interest. And there's a series of flowcharts and steps you must take to go through when those things come up. Usually if you disclose the conflict of interest up front, it usually isn't a big deal. Just say, yes, the article is on this drug made by this company that I consult for. And that's something that the editor and reviewer needs to know. But if you're upfront about it, it's much less of a problem than if they find out about it later. If it comes up during review that you haven't disclosed that conflict, that starts to look sketchy, that can often lead to a rejection. If an article's already been published and something comes to light that you haven't disclosed, sometimes it will lead to a retraction in extreme cases, but at very least an errata or corrigendum or something, basically indicating that you didn't disclose this correctly. Can you cite and reference a preprint? I think I mentioned this, but you can in some journals, and some do not want you to cite and reference a preprint. In the ones that do allow you to cite and reference preprints, you just need to make sure you're noting that it's a preprint. There are reference styles for that. Is there any legal way of withdrawing an article from a suspected predatory journal? If it hasn't published yet, in theory, you should be able to withdraw it. But because they are unethical entities, it's going to really depend on what processes they're using. Unfortunately, once you've submitted a journal to a predatory publisher, it's often out of your hands, and it's very hard to regain control of that article. But yeah, in theory, I mean, you can push on them and fight them and say you want to withdraw it and see where you get with it. I don't think you can legally go after them because you've voluntarily submitted your paper to them and probably signed off on them publishing it. I only have a couple minutes trying to see if there's anything else in here that I can cover quickly. Okay, so this is one I think that's useful to cover, especially for Elsevier journals. So there's a question about when an editor of one journal recommends or redirects the articles for another journal publisher after their rejection of the submitted articles. So this is within Elsevier, we have an article transfer service. I know other publishers have it as well, where a journal can say, you know, we've considered your submission. It's not going to be published at this time, but would you like to submit it to one of these other journals in Elsevier's portfolio? It basically just says, you know, they believe enough in your research that they think it would be a good fit for these other journals. And rather than having you have to go through the effort of going through the submission system and resubmitting everything to another journal for consideration, they will automatically transfer your paper to the new journal. So you don't have to do anything other than click a button. And then usually you're given the choice of whether you want your reviews, the paper's reviews, to transfer along with the article, or if you don't want the reviews to transfer, say you don't like one of the reviewers for some reason, you can ask them to transfer it without the reviews. It will just be considered like a new submission to the new journal, and probably need to be re-reviewed.
Well, Mary, I think we can stop here.
Sure.
You have very kindly answered more than 100 questions at this point. And we really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your presentation. As usual, it has been great and impactful. And I've received already a lot of good comments and words of thanks from our attendees. To all in attendance, please note tomorrow's session. I have shared the details in the chat box. If you registered for today, you would have automatically registered for tomorrow's session. Regarding all the questions that's about predatory journals, most of your questions will be answered by tomorrow's presenter during her presentation. She is going to cover some of these topics, as well as metrics used to evaluate authors, journals, and research topics, as well as research visibility and promotion. So thank you to our audience for attending today. I know we received a lot of requests for the recording. I have mentioned in the chat box that the recording will be uploaded onto the Elsevier Africa YouTube channel, but we are going to email all the attendees with a copy of the presentation and the links to the recording that will be sent after the session tomorrow. So I do hope that you can join us tomorrow. Thanks again to Mary, and have a wonderful day to all still in attendance.
Thank you, everyone.